Human beings are funny creatures. The one moment we are terrified of standing apart, standing alone.
Do we let them stand alone?
And yet when we penetrate certain areas of human psychology, we see that we want to be alone, we want to be individuals, we want to be private. And that brings us to the topic of perversion.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Not too long ago I made a bold claim. I said almost all of true crime is rooted in low self-esteem. Now, it's one thing to say that, but what does it mean? Would you believe me if I said the roots of perversion are low self-esteem? Now, a quick intertextual glance across the pond from Massapequa, Long Island, to a 37-year-old British ogre living in Harlow, Essex, demonstrates the powerful link between low self-esteem and extreme perversion.
This was Gavin Plumb discussing his obesity on a BBC show.
When I'm in pain, the pain gets so bad that it's crippling. Right, plan of action. I'll give you a brief rundown. Basically, we're going to hit it at night, less traffic on the road, etc. Chloroform, both of them. That way then they can both be easily restrained.
It's amazing how this big oaf of a man sounds like a small little mouse in certain ways, doesn't he?
Police! Stay where you are! Do not touch anything!
You're under arrest for conspiracy to kidnap.
Who?
Holly Willoughby.
I'm not going to lie, she's a fantasy of mine. I mean, she's a fantasy of a lot of guys, isn't she?
Later, Plumb said he knew what police were after.
You don't need to be a rocket scientist to recognize that Plumb is experiencing many of the same stock standard issues Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer suspect, was grappling with. Loneliness, social isolation, but more particularly social death.
Plumb's neighbours rarely saw him, but one heard him.
The criminal intertextualities don't end there. Besides the hermit aspect, there's also the creeping clutter, an analogy for the creeping psychological wounds, this sort of entropy that threaten to overthrow the cowering individual who can't muster the courage to enter the world, let alone be himself. This is why there's a fixation on others and on destroying others, because the self here has been and is being destroyed. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, there are several others in this deep dive series. If you want an even deeper experience in terms of the subject matter, you are going to have to join members only or join Patreon to get the extended version. If you enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. In the last paragraph on page 229 of Ernest Becker's seminal analysis of the human condition, and by the way, I think of Joseph Campbell as a kind of giant in terms of, his subject matter, in a similar way that I think of Ernest Becker as a giant, and you've put the two together and you really have something of an extraordinary insight into the human condition. In any event, in Ernest Becker's chapter that is euphemistically titled A General View of Mental Illness, he writes the following: The idea of low self-esteem is of course crucial, but we have to remember that self-esteem is not at first a symbolic problem, but an active orgasmic one. In other words, it's an everyday reality. Becker also provides a cryptic clue in what seems like a casual assessment of the issue. He says, self-esteem is not at first a symbolic problem. And so in the criminal sense, we can already see precisely how this is going to unfold. If the self-esteem issues become intractable and systemic, we can see how everyday issues will become totemic. What do we mean by totemic? Well, a totem is a natural object or animal that is believed by a particular society to have spiritual significance. A person or thing can also become symbolic. And so we saw with this Plumb character that a particular person achieved this totemic significance to him, right? Other words that I've used here, intractable, that's another way of saying an intractable problem, an unmanageable problem, an uncontrollable problem, an out of control, out of hand problem, stubborn, obstinate, obdurate, inflexible, unadaptable. And that is the same, these are the same descriptions for the psychology and the personality we're dealing with. Someone who's become inflexible, rigid, systemic as well. It's relating to a system. And so it is also something that is taking over this person's whole system, his whole state of mind. Now back to Becker. Low self-esteem takes root in the elemental physical experience of the infant. That's where it starts. When his experience gives him a confident narcissism, a sense of invulnerability. And so what on earth could ever challenge this? What on earth makes an omnipotent God vulnerable? Think about an infant that when he cries, these great beings run to it and give him whatever he wants. Comfort, nourishment, protection, entertainment. He's soothed, right? Obviously, engaging with others, peers, yes, right? What on earth could ever challenge the sense of potency? Well, obviously, as we get older, engaging with others, peers, yes, but also those we are sexually attracted to. It's in this area, this arena, that we don't have any control over the outcome. We don't have control over these strangers like we did over our parents. We don't have their cooperation, or shall we say we have limited control. In an ogre's case, or put it this way, if society decides you are an ogre, well then that lack of control is extremely lacking. And do you see what words we're already using? Control, self-control, society's control. And so what happens? Control becomes coercion. And coercion is very close to, in fact, a psychological cousin to perversion. Now then, what about the opposite? Becker. High self-esteem means such a sense of invulnerability. Think of towering Manhattan. In a way, all of these phallic structures, tall, invulnerable in a sense, right? And one gets it in three basic ways, the sense of invulnerability, this high self-esteem. Firstly, it derives from the power of the other, from the mother when she is a dependable support and does not interfere too much with the child's own activity, and also from a strong father with whom the child can identify. There's quite a lot here in terms of Heuermann. Was his mother dependable? And so if your mother's not dependable, are you going to get a sense of that invulnerability, that sense of natural potency, that natural agency, that sense of dependable support? Are you going to get that from your mother? And is your mother also going to provide, is she going to be able to back off, provide support, but also not interfere? And so the question here is, did she interfere too much? Mothers who interfere too much are coddlers, and they can turn boys who are or should be becoming men back into boys. They can turn their boys into mummy's boys. Gavin Plumb, surprise, surprise, was a mummy's boy. Let's go into his backstory briefly. Plumb's 62-year-old mother, who worked as a hospital healthcare assistant, declined to speak to the male, but she has resolutely stuck up for her son despite his obvious flaws and failings. His mum is a big part of his life, a family friend said. She adores him and worships the ground he walks on. She loves her children unconditionally. Described as a quiet child, Plumb grew up collecting Ghostbusters merchandise and playing the fantasy role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons. He was biggish, simple-looking, said the mother of an old school friend at Pasmore's secondary school in Harlow. He's always been like that. Indeed, by the age of 13, according to the Mail Online, Plumb had started to put on so much weight that he noticed girls would friend zone him rather than fancy him. Those who know him believe his future behavior around women is rooted in the sexual frustration he experienced from then on. We know that Heuermann had a strong father, a military man, but then after that he had no father. And so we can see, even with nothing else, that the absence of the father figure is already going to create identity issues and potency issues and agency issues. Now, intertextually, it's interesting how Brian Koberger had an interest in becoming a military person or a police officer. Why? Because he wants to lean onto these ordered systems of authority for a much-needed sense of identity and, yes, authority. Koberger ultimately gets a job as a security guard, a job which involves surveillance of the public and of public spaces. Gavin Plumb was a security guard for a while, which is also about becoming someone by putting on a uniform. Oh, I see we are at 11 minutes, so I'm not going to take it further than that. If you want to listen to the rest of this episode, and it is probably another 20 or 30 minutes, you are going to need to join either Patreon or members only. I'll put a link to both in the description. Thank you for joining us.